Welcome to the flipped lecture on Kate Chopin's The Awakening. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to some key important background material about the author Kate Chopin and her text The Awakening before you start reading it. And what you'll see as we cover in this brief lecture are these different topics, from biographies and the influence on the text to the reason why we're reading it. So it'll be wise of you as you listen to this to jot down key notes, so that when it's time for you to read the text and time for you to discuss it in class, that you have this background material with you and that you can access it at later dates. The author, her name is Kate Chopin, and she was born in 1850, and the novel is set in the late 1800s. And it's interesting to always know the author's background, because the reasons why people write is, predominantly influenced by what he or she goes through. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about with Kate Chopin's biography will also pop up in the text, and those are some key parallels that I want you to be able to not only identify based off of this lecture, but to identify on your own as you read as well. Kate Chopin was born in 1850. There was death everywhere in her life. Her parents had 5 kids, all of which died in infancy other than Kate Chopin. She was the only one of their children to live past the age of 25. Her sisters died at birth, and her brothers died in their early 20s. Her father was also killed when she was 5.5 years old. So she was raised in a world of death, and that was predominantly female, which is very important, that we'll talk about soon too. This death everywhere, from a very young age, impacted her life and plagued her as she went throughout her life. And she grew up in the Civil War. So not only was there death in the family, there was death all around her in the society itself as she grew up. But since there was no men around her and she grew up around women, these women were noted to be very smart, independent, single women, which is very unheard of at the time period. And lots of things that we'll talk about is the Victorian time period in which this is set. Women were not single often. They were not looked at to be smart or to be independent. They were supposed to be married off to men that would take care of them. So the fact that Kate Chopin, all that she knew from an early age throughout her life was strong, single, independent women, that made her very different from everyone else around her. But at the age of 20, she did marry a guy named Oscar Chopin, and they moved to Louisiana. Oscar really adored his wife and admired that independence and intelligence that she had that was very uncharacteristic for a woman at the time. And he allowed her this unheard of freedom that other women did not have. After their marriage and they lived in New Orleans, they had 7 kids, all before that she was the age of 28. There were 5 boys and 2 girls. So the fact that she was this independent, free woman with 7 kids made her a different kind of mother than other women around her at the same time, all of which that you'll see in the text itself. She began to support herself and her family with writing, another unheard of freedom at the time, and lots of her writing was inspired by true stories of the New Orleans area in which she and her family lived, in the infamous French Quarter, and that is where The Awakening is set as well. The Awakening was published in 1899, and by then she was well known as a woman writer and what's known as a local colorist, using local color, the influences, the people, the religion, the setting, to really dictate what kind of writing is made. Just think of what you do when you color. You bring something to life by adding detail to it. She brought to life the area in which she was at in New Orleans by really describing it heavily in her writing, which you will see as well. Over the course of her career, she had written over 100 stories, essays, and sketches for different literary magazines, but The Awakening is her most well-known text. When it was published, there was an uproar. There was this huge criticism and backlash to what she had to say. Because of her independence and what she had been through, she presented a different life of women, of motherhood, that was very controversial at the time. She was very hurt by the reaction to her book. And for the remaining 5 years of her life, she only wrote very little, even fewer of which was published. Her main character is named Edna Pontellier in the text, and like Edna, Kate had to pay the price for defying social rules. And so, as you see even today, people become famous because of controversy, and even more famous after their death. So The Awakening, although rejected when it was originally published, has become quite a well-known text. And even carries some of its original criticism and original kind of backlash at this into this present day era too, because it is still very controversial. I've mentioned the term Victorian. This image on your screen here it's probably something that you've seen before, maybe in older movies or in art or in other kind of exposures, but it's the time in society where there was a strict image for the woman. As you can see here in this painting, covered head to toe, looking very feminine, very frail at the same time. So the qualities you see in this picture are the qualities that you should envision with the female characters that you read in the text. There are strict moral codes for men and women. A marriage was a business union of sorts. A man could not marry a woman lower class than he. And if he did, there was a dowry, a financial payment, in order for him to be able to accept a wife lower than him. The men at the same time were out to look for women, but single women could not go out in society on their own. They had an escort. The escort would be there to keep an eye on the woman, to make sure that she didn't do anything too provocative. And if a man liked a girl, he had to go through her escort, her little protective service of sorts here, in order to meet up and to talk. And the escort would go with the man and the woman too as they dated, until it was decided that they would marry, and only until then can the woman be by herself, but then she is married. It was expected for a woman to be married as soon as possible in the early 20s. By middle 20s to late 20s, pushing 30, if a woman was not married, she was deemed a fallen woman. There had to be something wrong with her for some man not to have wanted her already, so therefore she was no longer desirable. So, these young women became mothers and wives very early in their lives, and thus that is what their life then served the purpose for, was to mother children and to raise them. The ideal image was that the woman was very frail, that she was as skinny as possible. Women would practice the art of fainting so that they seemed very weak, so that the man could swoop in and take care of her. Women would often drink vinegar to pallor and lighten their skin to make them seem as pale as possible. And their waist size, of course, the smaller the better. So as white as their skin could get, as skinny as their waist could get, and as weak as possible as what was deemed desirable. This fourth bullet here, this public versus private, this is something that the novel The Awakening explores a lot, is that what you appear to perceive of someone in a public life does not necessarily reflect who they really are as private citizens. So there are things that you were not allowed to do or say in public. You were not allowed to talk about sex, not allowed to talk about pregnancy. Even if the fact that a woman had a pregnant stomach, you were not allowed to address it. It was deemed very, very prude. It was a private act, and you weren't supposed to talk about someone's pregnancy or their children until they were born. So these things that seem very different today, as liberal and open as society is today, those are very strict guidelines of our past. And the novella is known as this Kunstlerroman. It's a term that is defined as a tale of a young woman who struggles to realize herself and her artistic ability. So think about what I've explained about the Victorian woman and how strict it is, and imagine if you were growing up at that time. The Awakening explores a change from that, a tale of Edna, who represents your author, Kate Chopin, as she struggles to really find herself and realize that the way society has set up things for men and women and children is not necessarily the best. And a lot of the novels that you read in high school explore things that should change in society, and that's what makes them controversial, but what makes them classics as well. Other key influences of the Victorian attitude are these two men on your screen. You may have studied about them before, you may have heard their names. The one on your left is Sigmund Freud, and then on the right is Charles Darwin. The Victorian and early 20th century attitude about humans and sexuality came from these two men that we'll talk about. Freud is very known about his exploration into human sexuality, and he claimed that most of our nature is rooted in that, the fact of finding a mate and reproducing for that purpose. And as a result, there are very strict codes to prevent humans from regressing or going backwards. So if you look at the Victorian society and how you were supposed to marry in your class but never lower, this kind of mating and reproduction is supposed to keep a very strict status and hierarchy of support in society based on that. Charles Darwin, you may have seen, talked a lot about human instinct, the survival of the fittest, and the human as an animal. And most people look to him as demoting the human race from something that's divine and powerful to something that's very basic and animalistic. So you think about the way that we act is very instinctual, and how we are mammals, and we have these animalistic instincts of sorts if we're challenged or if we're threatened. The way that we protect ourselves, the way that a mother protects her kids, are the same things that are noticed very very periodically in the animal society. So Sigmund Freud and Charles Darwin's observance of humans as animals in terms of mating and in terms of the way that they grow and the way that they live instinctually really influenced the writing of this time period. What you'll track throughout the text are